Okay, I'm Joe Trotter. I'm the director of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy at Carnegie Mellon, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the first of two lectures that's going to deal with the issue of policing in 20th century America. I'm especially excited about our speaker, Michael Fortner, coming to be with us today to share his thoughts. But before we do that, I want to underscore that Dean Krishnan of the Hines College and I have just had a good time really collaborating on this series. And I want to give Krishnan an opportunity to say a few words to you before we move forward with the introduction.
Thank you very much, Joe. Let me echo what Professor Trotter said. It's been a wonderful series, and I want to congratulate Professor Trotter on his leadership of this entire series and of cause. It's been a great partnership. Hines and Cause have collaborated over the years on a number of things, and this is a particularly appropriate set of topics. We had a series of speakers on health disparities that many of you attended, and now we have an outstanding collection of speakers. And today's speaker, we are very excited about this talk. And I once again want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you who have been an outstanding supporters of this series and attending this series over this entire semester. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward, as are all of you, to Dr. Fortner's remarks. And I'll turn this back over to Joe to introduce him. Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Before I introduce Professor Fortner, I want to just say, I want to echo Krishnan on support, the support that we've been getting for this series. First of all, the university has been very forthcoming in supporting this series. The president, Farnham Johannian, the provost, Jim Garrett, our dean, Richard Shinies, and our department head, Nico Slate. They have been extraordinary in bringing forward support for this effort. But also something that we don't always properly acknowledge is that over the years, we've gotten substantial support from corporate and foundation people, including the Giant Eagle Foundation, the Falk Fund, and the BNY Mellon Global Philanthropist Foundation. So we have been really fortunate to have excellent support for the work that we're doing. But almost nothing gets done if there's no staff support. And we've got an excellent staff with our business manager, Natalie Taylor, Eva Jean, our program coordinator, and Sri Mehta in the Hines College, our technical director in a way. We want to thank all of them for the extraordinary work that they do to get out the publicity and make contact about this particular series. But as Krishnan said, the audience is key. And so we want to thank you for taking time out on a Friday evening to be with us to hear this lecture by Professor Fortner. And so without further delay, let me introduce Professor Michael Fortner. Welcome to Pittsburgh, Michael.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you here. Indeed, we're excited and honored by your presence. You arrive at a good time. We're trying to really navigate a number of challenges. It's almost like this is a moment of hope as well as a moment of great challenge. And, you know, we are all very conscious of these issues that are playing out in the background, even as we talk. Derek Chauvin on trial for the death of George Floyd is taking over a lot of our attention because these are issues that are symptomatic of the challenges that we face. And we're just delighted to have you here because you are uniquely qualified to help us sort through the painful record of policing within African American history. And so let me introduce you. Dr. Fortner teaches political science at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He is also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD degree in government and social policy from Harvard University. At Harvard, he was also a doctoral fellow in the multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy. Among his many honors, he has been a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics in the UK. His scholarship explores the complicated intersections of American political development and political philosophy, especially questions of race, ethnicity, and class. Michael is the author of the prize-winning book, Black Silent Majority, The Rockefeller Drug Laws and the Politics of Punishment, published in 2015 by Harvard University Press. This book won the New York Academy of History's Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History. Dr. Fortner is also co-author of an edited volume on city politics titled Urban Citizenship and American Democracy, published by the State University of New York Press in 2016. His scholarly articles and essays have appeared in the nation's leading journals in political science, urban history, and public policy. Professor Fortner is an influential public intellectual as well as scholar. He has published in the most popular media outlets in the nation, including the New York Times, Newsweek, Time, Dissent, and the Atlantic magazine. Today, we are delighted that he will deliver a lecture titled From the Black Silent Majority to Black Lives Matter, the Transformation of African American Crime Politics from the 1970s until today. Please welcome Professor Michael Fortner.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Trotter, for that amazing introduction. I don't think that my remarks are going to be as good as that introduction suggests, but I'm going to try. Let me say a few words of thanks first to you, Professor Trotter, for inviting me here. It was such an honor and a privilege to receive this email many, many months ago from Professor Trotter that invited me to give this talk. I couldn't believe it almost. His work has been an inspiration to me, an inspiration to a lot of scholars, but particularly to me. There are not very many people trying to decipher the intersection of race and class and labor, but he's a pioneer in that field, and he has been great inspiration for me in my work. And so I hope today I'm able to, in my remarks, honor him and his work and thank him for inviting me. Also, I need to thank the staff for bringing me here. Evie, I know I drove Evie crazy. I was late on all kinds of emails and things, but they were gracious and wonderful. And so it really is an honor to come and be part of this illustrious series. So Professor Trotter asked me to do a few things. He said he wanted me to update my book, Black Silent Majority, for today, and then tease out some of the policy implications for this particular moment of Black Lives Matter, of uprisings in the street. And of course, I agreed to do that, but I'm not gonna do all of that. In part, I think I'm gonna save the last part for the conversation, for the back and forth and questions. What I wanna do is to suggest a few things and then provide some evidence for those suggestions. First, I want to talk about the over-policing of African-American communities and the under-protection of African-American communities. And I want to suggest that that duality is at the heart of what plagues our current crisis in the criminal justice system. And I also want to suggest that the over-policing of African-American communities produces robust, righteous social movements like Black Lives Matter, but the underprotection of African-American communities also has a consequence. And the consequence is a sort of darker, more punitive movement that I observed when I was working on the Black silent majority. And I want to conclude by trying to sort of reconcile those things and to open a conversation to figure out how do we seize this opportunity that Professor Trotter so beautifully talked about? And how do we reconcile the dual tensions of the Black silent majority and Black Lives Matter? But first, wait, there we go. I want to talk about me. I want to tell you who I am and where I come from and how I came to this work. What you're looking at right now is my kindergarten from, this picture was taken about 5 years ago. And back when I was there, many, many years ago, we didn't have all that fancy stuff that you see right there, like the slide or whatever. We just sort of, I just remember running around the playground. But what's missing from this picture is a housing project. And there was a housing project that sort of draped the back of the kindergarten. And you also don't see the gates. And there were some gates surrounding the kindergarten. And I selected this picture in order to convey in many ways what my experience was growing up in Brownsville, Brooklyn in the early 1980s, a time of a lot of crime, crack was on the streets. And my life was profoundly shaped by both the over-policing of Black communities, of my community, and the underprotection of my community. In terms of the underprotection of my community, my brother, when I was very young, one of my brothers was murdered in the streets, not too far from where this picture was taken. And I talk about in the book how that death, that murder by someone who's part of the neighborhood stayed with my family, stayed with me for our entire lives, and was this sort of dark cloud, this sort of dust of sadness that remained in the home. On the other hand, I had another brother who spent most of my childhood and teenage years in prison, locked up. I had a nephew who spent much of his teenage years in and out of the criminal justice system. So I come to this issue with these sort of dual dynamics of dealing with the pain of underprotection, of living in a community that is not sufficiently safe. And then also living in a community that's not sufficiently safe from state violence, from policing. And so I wanted to take that experience, that duality, and sort of build on it in writing The Black Silent Majority. I was inspired by Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow and a lot of the activism going on to decarcerate, a lot of the activism going to show the ways that white supremacy has structured policing and punishment in the United States. But I felt that there was a story that was not told, that part of the story that was told, the over-policing, was critical. But the other part of the story that wasn't being told was the underprotection, and how communities of color, particularly in New York, responded to that under protection. And so I went to Harlem in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and tried to figure out how did they respond to growing crime rates? How did they respond to increasing drug addiction in their community? And here is a op-ed in the New Amsterdam News, one of New York's black newspapers at the time. And it says, concern over the rising crime rate and almost flagrant criminal abuses in the central Harlem area is rising again, as it is all over the city proper. In some sections of the so-called Harlem business section after nightfall, it looks like a ghost town. People continue to be afraid to walk the streets at night. Churches, lodges, and other fraternal organizations curtail or even discontinue evening services and meetings. Even more serious in the Harlem Central District, however, is the fact that crime conditions and fear are just as prevalent during the daytime hours as at night. But then this piece continued and it said, the silent majority of Harlemites who sit by and watch their community be taken over by criminal elements without taking any kind of stand are simply surrendering to these elements. The responsibility of fighting crime lies among us, and this means lending support to those who are already on record as leading the fight against the muggers, the dope pushers, and any of the others who profit by illegal activities to the point wherein none of us is safe. And so Black Silent Majority told a story about how a group of activists, a sort of a grassroots movement, emerged to tackle this crime problem. And the argument in the book was that it set a context for the passage of Rockefeller's draconian drug laws, which established these mandatory minimums for the possession of a small amount of drugs. And the argument is that Rockefeller, who was trying to brandish his more conservative bona fides and be competitive with Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, sort of used this discourse to justify these draconian laws, use this story to make sense, to sell the drug laws to both whites and African Americans. And as Professor Trotter knows, the book received some intense criticism. There were some who wondered, I think rightly, whether or not the Black silent majority was actually representative of anyone. Was it possible that I was just sort of selecting some random, reverends, some random people that no one ever talked about, no one ever knows in Black history, and using those, their screeds to create and invent this, this group and this sort of grassroots energy? And so what I tried to do was to test this hypothesis, to see if we could find in survey evidence whether or not what the Amsterdam News said, what some of the reverends in my story said, whether or not the available survey data actually supported that, whether or not it was representative of those broader views. And this is what, one thing from that survey from the Vera Institute from 1970 was that nearly 80% of those Blacks in Bed-Stuy, another, at the time, not so much anymore, but at the time, an extremely African-American neighborhood, also sort of dealing with a lot of crime, a lot of poverty. And they were asked sort of, are you afraid that you're very likely or somewhat likely of being mugged or robbed? Nearly 80% said yes. Are you afraid of having your home broken into? Nearly 70% said yes. Having your property, car stolen, so forth and so on. Over 60% were afraid of being assaulted or raped. Now, it's one thing to be afraid. It's quite another thing to then turn to punitive policies as the solution for these things. And so it's quite possible that my sort of description of these attitudes were sort of broadly right, but I did not sufficiently capture what African Americans wanted to do in terms of responding to these problems. So one of the things I wanted to do is sort of figure out exactly what the people who were responding to this survey actually felt, what they said at the time, in addition to just responding to specific survey questions. And the survey had this sort of wealth of interviews that I was able to draw upon. And what you see here is that there is a clear sense that that their community in many ways is over-policed, that the police are racist, that they're terrible to Blacks and Puerto Ricans, that they're better for those who are in power, and that they usually, feel that people are guilty as soon as they see them because of their skin color, right? And that's sort of the over-policing part of the story that I want to tell today. Now, here's the other part of the story that I want to tell today. And if you read these, right, someone said they are too damn lazy to get up and do anything, right? That one of them said, they were getting beaten up on Fulton Street and they turned to the cops and the cops didn't do anything. Or they saw someone selling dope and they turned to the cops and the cops didn't do anything. And so again, you see in these interviews, more so than in the survey questions themselves, this very complicated relationship to police. On one hand, they understand the racism in the police department in New York City. On the other hand, they felt like these racist cops were doing enough to keep them safe. So then the question was, so what do they want them to do? What do you think cops should spend more time on? And as you see here, that they were very clear that they wanted cops to arrest drug dealers. They were very clear that over 50% wanted them to arrest drug users. Nearly 40 wanted them to quiet rowdy and noisy kids. And that actually, a quick side note, and this will come up later, that comes up a lot, that they not only complain about drugs and violence and death and murder and assault, but they also complain about quality of life problems. And they turn to the cops to do more about quality of life issues. And so I thought, okay, here we have some additional evidence, a solid survey that shows that the Amsterdam News was actually capturing something that was significant, something that was sort of part of the culture at the time in Harlem and Bed-Stuy and other Black sections of New York, that people were scared to death of crime. They wanted a better quality of life situation. And despite their misgivings about police and policing, they saw it as an option, as an important remedy for them to take to solve their problems. Now, then the question goes, and this is sort of Professor Trotter asking me to sort of update this, right? Because it's quite plausible that my story is unique to Harlem. It's quite plausible that my story is unique to that period of time in the early 1970s. And so what I did was try to sort of look nationally and over time, right? And what you see here is sort of a measure of crime. And you see that by the time the Amsterdam News is calling for the silent majority to sort of stand up and do something, that the crime rate is increasing, the homicide rate is increasing dramatically, and it stays extremely high for the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, and then it dips dramatically. Now, what's the effect of that on African Americans? Here's a chart that shows Black support for the death penalty over time, 1955 to 2005. And what you see is that among Blacks, Black men and Black women, that they're more skeptical of the death penalty, less supportive of the death penalty than whites, but their support sort of increases as crime worsens. and then decreases, right, as the crime situation gets better. And so we have here some evidence that there is a punitive impulse that is connected to crime, not in New York, but in the United States more broadly. Here's another question. Do you think the courts deal too harshly or not harshly enough with criminal defendants, right? And here you see sort of the average of responses of the survey question for the 70s, for the 1980s, the 1990s, and 2000s. And what you again see is that it's the answer to this question. Large amounts of African Americans think that the courts are not dealing harshly enough with criminals in the 1970s. It goes up a little bit in the 1980s. It stays high in the 1990s, and then it decreases dramatically, right, in the next century. And so again, I think this is another piece of evidence to suggest that even after that period, even after dealing with heroin in Harlem and violence in Harlem, that you still see some kind of sense of a part of the Black population that is extremely punitive and has turned to, because of the crime situation, punitive remedies as their solutions. Now, what's going on in a lot of these communities to make them turn so dramatically to policing and punishment as solutions? And here is this flyer for a rally in Queens, New York, against crack. You have in New York City and a lot of cities across the country, starting in the mid 1980s and increasing until the early 1990s, what they call the crack epidemic. And that ignited another round in New York City of the Black silent majority. It created another group of grassroots activists who were mobilizing for greater public safety and who were turning to extremely harsh remedies to solve this problem. Now, here is a quotation from one of the speakers, leaders of this movement. And he was, again, I mean, he's a reverend. He could have been a random reverend, but he wasn't. He was a member of city council in New York City. He was very influential in politics in the Bronx. And he decided to help lead this sort of grassroots movement against drugs in New York City at this time. And so I just want to read what he said. As Black clergy, we are ready to protest and march against the evil of crack and other drugs until the gates of hell burst open. Never before has the world seen such an epidemic. We appeal to all churches, community groups in the nation to join with us and take a stand. While drugs ought to be the top priority of every level of government, we as clergy have to drive out this devil ourselves. Just as slavery was abolished, not by Lincoln's emancipation, but when Black leaders such as Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner rebelled, so we too must rise up and rid ourselves of this menace. We make no excuse for anyone selling or using drugs, poverty, unemployment, or whatever. Rather than excuse, we will protest and expose those who deal drugs. We will do all in our God-given power to save our youth, our families, and our communities from Satan's hold. Now, this is sort of very dramatic rhetoric, and I've been, in Pentecostal churches in the Bronx, and so I know, what that felt like. But it again, I think, emphasizes a punitive impulse in Black culture in New York City that persisted from the Black silent majority in the 1960s and 70s in their fight against heroin until this sort of new grassroots movement and their fight against crack in New York. Now, the question again is, how representative is this? Did Black folks, maybe this is just another crazy a reverend from, Holy Rollers, one of the Holy Rollers. I don't think people even use that term anymore, but they used to call them Holy Rollers, who were sort of from sanctified churches, and that they necessarily were fundamentally conservative, but may not have represented what African Americans broadly felt about crack and wanted to do about crack and drugs during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Here is a poll from 1994. And this is important because it comes around the time that people are thinking about, talking about, debating the infamous crime bill. And what you see here is that Black folks are supportive of curfews for people under 18. They are supportive of three strikes laws, where if you commit sort of 3 felonies, you are gone for the rest of your life or for a long time. And a sizable amount are in support of stop and frisk in 1994, right? So again, it's not that this sort of crazy Reverend Holy Roller, unique to New York story, but it is sort of a broader punitive impulse that's responding to fundamental change in these communities. Let me go forward, right? Now, here's another one that gets in more detail. Now, this one, I love this question because it sort of says you have a variety of options, right? And all of these were sort of part or debated to be part of the 1994 crime bill. And the question is sort of for African Americans, which ones do you think would be sort of most effective? What do you want to do again, right? And of course, there are money here. You see that there's extremely high support for money for youth programs, but there's also a significant amount of support for mandatory sort of, 3 strikes. There is a large amount of people who want to try children as adults. There are people who want more cops, 100,000 more cops on the street. So even when given an option of proposals, yes, you do have some who want to focus on rehabilitation and youth programs, but you do have many who want to lock a lot of people up, who believe that more cops on the street is a effective solution to the crime problems that they're facing in their communities. I'm going to return to this chart because I think it helps to understand the systemic shift in Black anti-crime views that takes place that has taken place over the last 20 or so years. And again, it shows the high crime rates, right, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then this sort of dramatic drop. And I want to suggest that this dramatic drop provided a useful context for reform movements and for Black Lives Matter, right? Now, but it did not necessarily cause people to give up on police and policing as their preferred approach to public safety. This is one of my favorite survey questions I've come across in all of my work. And this is from 2014, Quinnipiac survey of Blacks in New York, of New Yorkers, and these are the responses of Blacks in New York. And it says here, how do you think about the cops, right? I mean, are they your friends? Are they your enemies? What? And what Black New Yorkers said is that they're neither. And I think that's an important observation, that it's not in this sort of new era. You have people who argue, right, that Black folks hate cops, but that doesn't sort of show up in this at all. Just about 20% say that they consider Black cops enemies. A smaller amount, but closer to that amount, consider them friends. But most Black folks say neither. And I think that goes to, again, the fundamental problem that I introduced this talk with. And that is sort of the over-policing and under-protection of Black folks. That Black folks are saying, look, we don't hate the cops. We don't think they're our friends, but they don't come when we need them. right? And then that when they do appear, right, they tend to be brutal. And so we're trying to sort of wrestle with this duality. And I think that question gets to that. Here is, again, in some more survey evidence from New York, 2014, their views of sort of white, Black, and Hispanic views towards policing in New York. And as you see, the Black is in the red. A sizable amount of African Americans, much more than whites, believe that we can sort of stop and frisk, right? And still make New York City a safer place, right? So there is, in this new era of sort of low crime rates, there is a sense that policing has gone too far and that we want to focus on the over-policing, more so perhaps than the under-protection. But the under-protection is always there, because the next question says, do you approve? The next question that I want to talk about is about a proposal on the city council, and that is to add more cops, right? 1,000 additional cops, and everyone in New York, Black, white, Hispanics, all support that. The next question is about, do you think cops should patrol public housing? And do you think they should ask people for their IDs in the hallway? Now, again, for a lot of people who don't, or not familiar with public housing, the projects, might not understand this question, but I did. As I said at the beginning, I sort of grew up in public housing in New York. There was sort of a lot of crime in the building, a lot of the older women, a lot of the elderly in the building didn't like a lot of the young people who were just walking around. They didn't know who they were. And so the response to this question made a lot of sense to me. But again, it shows the extent to which there are significant parts of the Black community in New York City in 2014 who still feel as if police and policing are a critical policy intervention in their lives. Now, we had in New York City, of course, with Trayvon Martin, we had the growth of Black Lives Matter. And then we had, after the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, we had this robust movement, people marching in the street for days. And the question is, what effect did that have on Black attitudes in New York? Did that sort of dramatically change how Blacks thought about police and policing? And the answer is not so much, or the answer is that it post Eric Garner, what you see are really serious divisions in the Black community over what to do. And I don't know if you could, how well you can see this right now. I'm sorry for all the words, and I tell my students never to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And because the questions themselves are so important. And each of these questions are asking about quality of life issues. And they're saying, do you want cops coming around, not just sort of policing, shootings or other violent crime, but do you want cops coming around issuing summonses for people who are drinking, who are drunk, people who are making loud noise? Again, going back to the rowdy kids in the earlier survey. And a surprising number of Black folks in New York City said yes, that they see a role for cops in improving the quality of life in their communities. And then there was one question here that just sort of blew me away, right? So part of what happened with Eric Garner, if you remember, is that he was selling loose cigarettes and he was getting arrested for selling loose cigarettes, and the interaction led to his death. And so the question here is sort of like, do you think cops should ignore people selling loose cigarettes on the streets? And Black folks are split. 47% say they want to stop people, we should stop people doing it, and 40% said that we should ignore it. And I think this is getting to this current moment, and what I think really is the fault line in the Black community on the issue of policing. And that is, we've had a righteous movement of Black Lives Matter who have said, that the system of policing, the criminal justice system in the United States is fundamentally racist. And if you believe that it is fundamentally racist, to talk of reform is a folly, right? How can you reform a system that is fundamentally broke? How can you reform a system that was created to destroy, police Black folk, right? And so they're offering this movement, right, sort of dramatic proposals to abolish police, to find other kinds of remedies for violence in these communities. But then the question is, sort of, where is the community on these questions? And here is a question from Pew about African-American preferences for police spending, right? And, there's a sizable amount that wants police spending decreased a lot, but not, but that's less than the amount of Black folk who want it sort of stay the same. There's some who want to decrease a little. I'm never sure what decrease a little actually means when you're sort of talking about sort of racist institutions. But I'm struck by the amount of people who, after, and this poll is from after George Floyd's murder. And after all of that, Black folks are still saying that they turn to policing for their strategies, a main strategy of ensuring public safety. But there are differences. There are profound age differences that sort of young brothers and sisters who have been righteously protesting in the streets, leading a vigorous uprising day after day over the summer, that they see these things dramatically different than older African Americans. And you see this question, again, it's a version of the last slide. And younger African Americans and whites are more likely to say, a large amount of them anyway, are likely to say that they want police funding decreased by a lot. But African Americans above 50, whites above 50, are really into policing funding staying the same, not to funding the police, just sort of keeping funding the same. And a decent amount of Blacks over 50 believe that policing funding should be increased a lot, which was kind of weird to see. So what do we take from this? What do we do now? Where do we go from here? As the question was once posed. And I want to suggest that we need to, first let me say this. We definitely need to attend to the ways in which blatant racism, white supremacy, right, is active in police departments, in police unions. But there is, I think, a critical debate among African Americans, within the African American community, about what ought to be the best model for public safety. You have a segment of the community who, perhaps because of their experience with the high crime era of the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, who have turned to police for safety, turned to police for a better quality of life. And then you have young Black and brown folk who have had to live with that regime for 20 years, who are crying out for a different model. And so I think the question is, what model of public safety do we as a community, African Americans, do we want? How can we deal with the over-policing of Black lives and the under-protection of Black lives in ways that save Black lives? Thank you.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me? Am I okay?
Yes.
Shri? Okay, good. Hey, Michael, thanks very much for that riveting talk and an insightful talk. Lots of data that you presented, key ideals about the tension between over-policing and under-protection. I think there's a lot that you put on the table for us. And so what we want to do is to open this up to our audience, to raise questions in the chat, and Evie will read out those questions so that everybody can understand the issues that you are being asked to address. So let us begin.
I did get one question directly. I have a question from Wendy Goldman. Your data resonates strongly with my experience growing up on the Lower East Side in New York City in the 1970s. Yet, how do you measure crime, and how can we separate out rising crime rates from harsher policing?
This is such a great question, and it's one that people in the field wrestle with, right? Because crime is both real and constructed, right? It's both social and political, and you have to be careful when discussing crime because it's not clear whether you are with the data you are just sort of showing policing, or whether you're showing an actual social phenomenon that's going on in society, right? And so that's why when I talk about crime rates, I use homicide data. I don't use sort of broad definitions of violent crime or property crime or other things, which are subject to, again, policing, subject to reporting dynamics, right? Sometimes people may or may not feel comfortable reporting some types of crimes, but I use homicide data. Why? Because it's very hard to manufacture dead bodies in a neighborhood. And so I find that using homicide data gives you a great sense of shifts over time and crime patterns in cities in the United States.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to type them up in the chat window. I'll be happy to read them out loud.
Michael, while people are collecting their thoughts, I would like to ask if you could talk a little bit about these activists who mobilized to actually, to bring some of the drug dealing and so on under control. And it seems like ministers were a major force in this mobilization. Right. And I'm wondering if, and there's the question of the Holiness Church, that you talked about. Right. But then there are these range of churches. Yes. And then there's also the Nation of Islam and other groups. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about who these activists were and the kind of spectrum, that they encompass. Yeah.
Right. So that's a brilliant question. Look, it is one of the things I love about Black folks and Black history is that the church is such a pivotal part of the community, but there's so many different churches that have their own identities, their own values, their sort of class dimensions, right? AME different from Baptist, different from Holiness Church, right? And so one of the things that I sought to do when I first started this research, and this shows up in the first article that I published on it, was to sort of see whether or not you had a coming together of different congregations. Because in Harlem for a long time, churches were exhibited a clear class dynamic, right? So a lot of the wealthy, more famous people who dress well went to Abyssinian, and other folks went to other churches. And so I wanted to see whether or not you had a coming together of these different congregations representing these different theologies within the African American community. And there's a meeting in New York City at an AME church in which they invite Rockefeller, and it's a joint meeting of multiple congregations. and they press him on the issues of drugs and crime in the community. And I use that moment to sort of say that despite these sort of clear theological and cultural differences within the Black church, that they do come together at this critical moment. To fight crime. The nation is is another question that I love, because it's the nation hates drug dealers. And the nation at the time, so the early part of the 60s, I've got some, there were meetings with Malcolm X, A. Philip Randolph, and other leaders about some of these things. And Malcolm X was, he hated drug dealers, and the nation did. I mean, they were ready to run them out of Harlem themselves, even if violently. They were just a bit more concerned about drug users, particularly women. And so they came at this, in many ways, they were more, they're harsher to some extent than some of the Christian churches towards drug dealers, but more lenient to some of to drug users than some of the Christian churches.
Okay. Go ahead, Evie.
I have a next question from Aisha Scott. Many of the same reverends and leaders who called for more punitive measures also called for narcotic hospitals and international sanctions on countries that produced the drugs flowing through Black communities in the 1980s. How do you explain why the calls for punitive measures were met and while those for public health measures were ignored? Does this speak to the systemic racism that left the Black community vulnerable to the crack epidemic in the first place?
So two things. So part of what I do in the book is to suggest that, or to talk about the reverends in Harlem at the time who went from embracing rehabilitation and being supportive of what Rockefeller passed in 1962, the Metcalfe-Volcker Act, which was sort of the most progressive anti-drug policy in the country that allowed for rehabilitation, but didn't actually fund the policy, didn't actually provide beds for users. And what the law did was that it said users could elect to go to jail or get treatment. And so users would elect to go to jail because they would spend less time in jail than they would in treatment. And so the argument in the book is that the structural failures of the law sort of helped create this more punitive environment in Harlem, and had them sort of turn their back on a lot of the sort of drug users at the time. Now, in my story, they were somewhat supportive of rehabilitative approaches, but by the time 1973 came around, the reverends in my story, at least, they stopped caring so much about the consequences of punishment. I mean, when Rockefeller signed the drug laws he had Black preachers and activists around him in Albany. And one of them, and a reporter asked one of them, said, look, you do know that the law, although designed to catch drug dealers, will also catch drug users who may get caught with a few ounces of drugs. And they said, it's a risk we're willing to take. And so part of the argument in the story that I tell about the 1970s in Harlem is that they were willing to risk having drug users getting caught up in the criminal justice system because they were so concerned about the overall violence and crime that was going on in the community. In terms of the 1980s, I mean, I think it is also the case that they did want Charlie Rangel, who was a U.S. representative from Harlem, who wanted sort of a robust international approach to these issues. But I think I'm less kind to some of the reverends because a lot of their work was focused more on punishment than rehabilitation. And it's not simply the case that the sort of the racial order only gave them punishment. It's also the case that many of them made a decision to emphasize punishment more than rehabilitation. And I think that we need to hold them accountable for that, and not necessarily to sort of see their limitations as a product of the racial order, but as a function of their own agency.
Thank you. The next question from Alexandra Allen. What feedback have you gotten from community members on non-police emergency response for issues of mental illness and substance use specifically?
Right. So the data suggests that the polling suggests that people would prefer, both white and Black people, to be honest, right now, after the movement of the last couple of years, would prefer sort of non-police response to medical emergencies and mental health crises. And there is actually a huge, I think right now, there's a huge opportunity to try to invest in that. And because I think now, again, given the low crime rate, I think people have become a little bit more creative in how they think about solutions for these problems, and that includes having social workers and medical experts sort of come respond to these crises rather than having police. With that said, the other thing I do want to emphasize is that the moment of opportunity may be closing. And one of the things that I am concerned about is that crime rates are rising in a lot of cities, and that might close the window for a lot of this good work that Black Lives Matter has done. And so we may seem, if we don't find a way to deal with the rising crime rates in a lot of these cities, we may see a reemergence of some of the darker attitudes that I talk about in my story.
Thank you. And I have a question from Will Tompkins. Thank you for your presentation. Years ago, the late Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a book entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? The question I present to you is, all the things considered, where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, two things. I think we need to find another model of public safety in urban communities. I think there may be a small minor role for policing to deal with what they call hotspots, places where there's sort of a lot of sort of violence, gun violence, et cetera. But for the most part, I think we need to have a different approach. And that approach needs to be part of a broader, a different strategy to urban communities. We need more investment in these cities. I mean, part of the story that I also tell in the Black Silent Majority is that what you have is a rising Black middle class who gets stuck in the neighborhood that's also losing resources, right? And that they're responding to that. And so what we have to do, I think, is to sort of think about new models of public safety, but have that be part of a broader strategy to cities, one that sort of invests in cities, one that tries to create good work, what my family called good jobs, for Black and brown folks in cities. And if we could do that, I think we can create conditions or maintain the low crime conditions that create space for us to be creative about public safety approaches.
Thank you. This is all the questions I have so far. If anyone wants to type something in.
I think I will raise this question with Michael. Michael, I think historically there have been movements in the African-American community to really employ Black policemen, believing that would be part of a solution, rather than the problem.
Right.
And so historically and in more recent times, how would you assess that particular
That is so
movement?
problematic, my brother. that is Black cops kill just like white cops, right? Black cops will hurt you just like white cops. I'm working on a piece right now on racial capitalism that wrestles with some of these issues. And one of the things I talk about is the ways in which a lot of the sort of Black power mayors of the 1970s, Maynard Jackson and others, said the solution for white police brutality was to have more Black law enforcement officials, right? That if we hired more Black cops, if we had more sort of Black folks at the head of these law enforcement organizations, like that would make a huge difference, right? Atlanta today, still a problem, right? 50% of about maybe a little more than 50% of the Atlanta police are Black, still over policing of poor Black neighborhoods, right? So representation in that situation is not necessarily justice. And so I think we need to, and again, this is not to sort of take away from the possibilities that can be there if we do have a more diverse police force. Evidence suggests that adding women could actually make us safer, that women police officers are less brutal than men police officers. So if we're going to think about diversity, we might have to sort of think broadly beyond race. But I do think the point is, and this is, I think, the cutting edge of the movement that for Black lives that have raised, and that is, if an institution is fundamentally problematic itself, adding more Black faces is not going to change that dynamic. And I think we need to think critically about that. And we need to sort of see these sort of police departments not just as engines of Black social mobility, but see them as sort of fundamental problems of Black community, even when they're staffed by Black folk.
Thank you.
I did get one more question from Kay Regard. Thank you for this talk. Within the Black community, did the data suggest any differences in attitudes towards policing based on intersectional identities, like, for example, gender, sexuality, class?
Oh, wow. So this is such an interesting question. So women, for the most part, tend to be less punitive than men. That's, I think, somewhat not surprising. The class issue is complicated because the question is, how do you measure class in a lot of these surveys, right? So the way I think about it is that African Americans who have sort of a lot of education, you might want to think of them as being in a different class, but they tend to be more liberal on these issues. But African Americans who have, again, what my family members might call good jobs, people who take civil service exams and work for the city, and are not poor but are sort of middle class and have some resources, they tend to be a bit more conservative on these questions. And so I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to think through how class operates in Black community, how class is tied to work, but also how class is tied to cultural norms, and then the relationship between those things and policing. But I do think there are some very interesting intersectional dynamics that shape how different parts of the Black community think about police and policing.
Thank you. I have a question from Alex Tabor. What are some ways that this data and research point toward institutional solutions outside the police?
Right. So this data, doesn't necessarily point to institutional solutions outside of the police, except that they do, I think, show that Black folks are concerned about a host of issues in their community, and crime gets lumped into those things, right? Black folks want to live sort of, good lives. They want to live in safe streets. They want clean streets. And so one of the things that I take away from the surveys that, it's particularly the ones in New York, because some of the other things I didn't show you was that they also wanted sort of better social services. They also wanted better jobs, right? And so I think the takeaway for me for a lot of these data is, again, that what we need is a different approach to cities. That that the austerity of the last 30, 40 years only creates a context of intraracial conflict and suffering. And that we need to rethink the ways in which we invest in these communities, rethink how we organize these communities, rebuild the civic infrastructure in these communities, right? Strengthen. I mean, I'm somewhat critical of a lot of the churches, but they play a critical role in a lot of these places in dealing with crime and a lot of social services. And so I think the more that we can, as a sort of a structural approach to this, have a robust federal policy to cities that invests in them, that also invest in the civic infrastructure in these communities, that will sort of create a context where people will not need to turn to policing and punishment to solve their problems.
Thank you. That's all the questions I've had.
There are no other questions in the chat? Okay. Well, Michael, you've done an extraordinary job responding to the various questions that we have. I'm going to raise one more.
Please.
And you can deal with this in any context, but I'm struck by, the question of violence, sort of vigilante activities, that sort of surfaced a little bit in what you were saying. I think when you were talking about the Muslims, you almost said, they might have even considered violence, against these people. But I just want you to talk a little bit about that, because in those kind of desperate situations, it's conceivable that some people will develop paramilitary type groups to try to bring some of these things to heel. And so I just wanted you to see if you could illuminate that a little bit.
So one of my great colleagues, a political scientist, Lisa L. Miller, she talks about racialized state failure. And what she means by that is that a lot of the violence that we see in cities is a product of almost of a failed state in these communities, right? A failed social safety net and a failed sort of policing structure. And I think vigilantism in many ways is a product of the sort of failed state that a lot of urban communities find themselves in, right? That if you feel underprotected and your over policing doesn't solve your problem of protection, right? You need to find a solution. And at times, I mean, one of the actors in my story in the Black Silent Majority, Reverend Dempsey, he would carry a gun, a pistol, through the streets of Harlem. Like fool, what's wrong with you? Why are you carrying this pistol? But that's because, again, the sort of the underprotection that they felt, the sense that the state had sort of fundamentally failed them in providing, public safety and a social safety net, caused many to look for a lot of those dramatic remedies, including vigilantism.
Okay.
I did get another question from Stacy Akines. Can you discuss the Muslim community's role and success in public housing communities, such as the Watts Peace Treaty in 1992 between the Crips, and then also in Baltimore's housing projects and the pushback from Jewish communities? I
don't, the pushback from Jewish communities part, can they say a bit more about that? But I will say this, that over time, and it's not just the nation, but other traditional civil rights leaders have tried to not make peace in Los Angeles with sort of the gangs, but they said that, look, that part of what they need to do in a lot of these communities is to stop these gangs from killing each other. And that needed, and the police weren't doing it. And so they needed to sort of intervene in order to sort of broker these agreements. And so the nation has been critical in this aspect, but other Black leaders as well. And so they have tried to, later on, try to find a way to sort of resolve the violence, in these sort of peaceful ways without sort of relying on police. And today we have in a lot of communities, and this may be a model that people want to pursue, sort of violence interrupters who come in, or people, who know the neighborhood, and they come in when there is sort of a lot of violence, and they try to intervene and connect individuals with resources, and there's some evidence that they've been effective. So I think the peace treaty, but more generally, there are policy models out there that don't rely on policing to sort of stop the violence. And so again, but the question is, what kind of political will do we have to scale up these kind of programs and not have these things sort of be particular to particular moments in particular communities?
Okay. Any other question, Evie?
Joe, if I might ask a question.
Okay.
Dr. Fortner, thank you again for a really exciting presentation. One of the things that in prior work that you've written about is the point that you make about the paradox that you refer to about ensuring that communities are safe from state violence and at the same time safe from violence committed by fellow citizens. Which I found, really, in many ways summarize some of the remarks you made today as well. So in August or so of 2020, there were these Gallup polls that were conducted about support from various communities about the extent of police presence that communities wanted to provide this, to address this paradox, if you will. And I was wondering if you could comment on two interesting things that surfaced. One was that Black and brown communities roughly wanted the same level of police presence as white communities, but however felt that unlike white communities, that they were not treated with courtesy and respect by the police communities, like difference of 20% versus 60%, I think was, if I remember those numbers correctly. But going back to your paradox point and how this then tallies with the communities wanting police presence, and some have argued that the elections, that there was support for that, the rhetoric around policing. Could you comment on this intersection of these different data points?
Yeah, so look, I have that chart. I didn't include it today, but I do have that chart. And I've written about it. And it is, I think, symbolic of the tension that I talk about, of people feeling sort of over-policed and underprotected, right? That they don't want the police presence to change dramatically, but they also understand police are horrible to people of color. And I think that is the dilemma that Black folks have been in for the past 40, 50 years in urban cities. And coming out of that dilemma is well, one, I think there is an opportunity to sort of come out that dilemma. But it means that I think we need to sort of seize this opportunity that has been created by this mobilization. With that said, I think part of this needs to be done internally within the African-American community, within communities of color, because I think part of the mistake a lot of activists have made, and a lot of, I think, elite publications have made, is to sort of assume defund had a sort of a broad-based support within communities of color, and that wasn't the case. And I think that sort of, activists, policymakers need to sort of deal with the nuances, deal with the paradoxes, instead of sort of offering these sort of stark policies that don't reflect how people feel. And that means respecting people's fear of crime, right? That crime is real for a lot of folk. And, right now there's a lot of carjackings, there's a lot of, shootings, and we need to take that seriously as a concern. As we need to take state violence seriously. And so I think, moving forward, the conversation needs to attend to both of those dynamics and find a policy model that allows us to be safe in our homes, but also frees us from brutality from the state.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. one final question for you, Michael, if
Yes,
there are
sir.
no others. Okay. You know, we have a number of graduate students in this audience, and maybe a question that you can talk about is the research component. What's the next generation of research along the lines of policing and so on, historically, do you see unfolding? And I'm especially interested if you see a next generation of students sort of taking up that question that you took up in New York and really seeing how that played out in Detroit. How did it play out in Chicago?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think we have been blessed with a lot of rich and powerful work that identifies sort of the white supremacist organization of policing in American cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, and a lot Baltimore. But what we don't have enough of are sort of, people's histories of crime, and how people understood crime in these situations. I think one of the biggest mistakes in the literature of mass incarceration is that they tried to divorce crime from incarceration. Now, I'm not saying there's a direct relationship, but crime provides a context for what goes on, for the politicization of crime and for mass incarceration. And I think the next generation has to attend to the voices of people who are dealing with crime. I think the question of intersectionality is also a critical component to this, right? How were Black women in these communities dealing with rising crime? What did they do uniquely? What kind of capacities did they bring to bear? Also, how did marginalized communities within marginalized communities, how do they deal with policing? What's their history? How do we think about, policing of gays and lesbians during the 60s and 70s, and then how do we sort of think about them now, right? That should sort of, there's a paradox there too, that they were fundamentally problematic in dealing with that community, but should we turn to them now when you have the murder of transgendered women and you're dealing with a lot of these consequences? And so I think there's a lot of very interesting questions about intersectional questions about how people make sense of the violence that inheres in their lives because of their the marginal nature of their marginal situation within the broader social structure, and their response to that, and how we respect that response, how we understand that response, and the ways in which political systems either respond or do not respond to that response. I think that's where the sort of the new generation of the literature is.
Well, thanks very much. These virtual things, I wish that you could hear our applause. But let us give Michael a round of applause, virtual applause, okay? Thank you very much. It's been a joy, learning and listening to your insights on these issues, and for, laying out a kind of a research agenda that our graduate students are going to definitely pick up on and move with it. Absolutely. So thanks a lot, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you all so much
for coming. And Krishna, you want to have the last word?
Dean, thank you, Dean.
I just want to say thank you very much. This is a very informative and a really wonderful presentation. I learned a great deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, bye.